Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Cecilia Gonzalez, and I am one of the coordinators of the Agriculture Nutrition Community of Practice. I will start just with some instructions on this call and the use of the chat box and Zoom before we get started with the introduction. So we ask that you keep your microphones on mute throughout the call. But please keep your comments and your questions coming via the chat box. The purpose of this call is for it to be participative, so we will be looking at all your comments and questions and trying to address them as possible during the call. If you please access the Zoom features, we would like you to access the participant menu, and to do that, you can hover over your screen at the bottom towards the left, see the participant menu, and if you click on that, you will see the menu, and there is the possibility to raise your hand in that menu. In order to raise your hand, that will be an indication that you want to speak, and there will be that opportunity during a time at the call. You can also access the chat feature by clicking on the chat icon in the menu. And if you're having issues seeing that, it could be because of your view options, just make sure to exit full screen. And the view options are on the top of your screen. If you hover over your mouse over there, you will check view options and you can exit full screen and try to see side-by-side mode instead. If you are joining via mobile, the features aren't the same, but you can also access them when you tap on your screen, and it gives you options also at the bottom of the screen. And if you don't see all the options like participants and chat, then you can see some dotted lines and you can access the options there too. If you're joining via call and only audio, we ask that you send your questions or comments via email to ag2nut@gmail.com. And we have someone who is doing tech support, so if you have any issues, please do put it in the chat box, and our tech support person will help you. Anna, I think that's all I have. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you very much for the introduction to help people get oriented to the new platform that we're using today. And welcome, everyone. I'm Anna Herforth. I am also one of the coordinators of the Ag2Nut community of practice. And I'm really grateful for everyone who's joining today to join this discussion together, and to Tesfai Hailu, who brought this to our attention as a member of the community of practice globally and in Ethiopia. There's never been a better time for a community like this. We were built for this kind of virtual interaction in a world where currently it's difficult to have face-to-face interaction. And we are already in place to have a network to enable interaction with each other at a distance. And this is an issue that not only Tesfai, but others have written messages about on our listserv and on many listservs, I'm sure, that you're part of in other areas on agriculture, on food systems, and on nutrition. The key question that we're grappling with here is, how can we act as a community in our respective roles in our different diverse organizations, and using our expertise to, how can we act so that this pandemic does not turn into a larger humanitarian crisis? So beyond just the disease itself, how can we mitigate or prevent crises for food security, for agricultural systems functioning, for poverty, and for malnutrition. So that's kind of the key question for us today. The purpose of this discussion is firstly, just to be able to discuss, to come together as a group of people with the same concerns around the issues of how this pandemic can be affecting food systems and how it may be interacting with malnutrition. And then also, we would like to, out of this call, we would like to come up with a document that we'll share that sort of synthesizes what we discuss and resources, and kind of if there are priorities that emerge as far as what each of us can bring in our own efforts or our own advocacy, our own interaction with leaders or as leaders to mitigate any negative effects that are coming from this crisis on food systems and on nutrition. So thank you very much to the panelists who are here today to share the knowledge and expertise that they have to get the discussion started. Firstly, Tesfaye Hailu, who's at the Ethiopian Public Health Institute and also a PhD student at Wageningen University. He'll be bringing this topic to the floor and outlining some of the key questions and concerns that are arising in Ethiopia and Africa more broadly, and concerns that are really relevant globally and particularly in low-income countries. And we also have Stenika Unuma, who is the coordinator of the UN Standing Committee on Nutrition, who is going to be sharing a summary of some of SCN's very, very recent hot off the press work on possible food environment disruptions by COVID-19, and also highlighting some resources and examples of actions that are being taken and what UN agencies are proposing to do to respond. Will Masters is here, professor from Tufts University at the Friedman School, who will be bringing up issues around economic aspects of how supply chains and markets could change and what can be done to keep them functioning for all people. Selena Ahmed is here from Montana State University, and she does a lot of work on food systems in China and also with indigenous communities in North America, and has some lessons learned from observations that she is getting from colleagues on the ground about food systems in China during and after the height of the pandemic there. And finally, we have Namukolo Kovic, who is the Senior Research Coordinator of Ag2Nutrition and Health at IFPRI in Addis Ababa. And she will be bringing together some reactions on nutrition and food system realities in Africa and policy priorities for protecting both nutrition and food systems. So thank you to the panelists. Also, thank you very much to Will Masters and the tech support at Tufts University for enabling us to use this Zoom platform today. And thank you also to ANH Academy for co-sponsoring and promoting this discussion, and our communities, Ag2Nut and ANH Academy are really one big community in this sense on the importance of these issues. So just to get started, I believe Will has control of the slides. Will, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So as I read the email that Tesfaye had sent to the community about concerns about the disease and how it may be different in low-income settings where there's high burdens of undernutrition, it really brought to mind this research back from 1995 showing that there is an interaction. Could go back to the last pie chart, thank you. So there's an interaction between disease, infectious disease, and undernutrition, resulting in much higher mortality for those who are malnourished. And what this research showed, led by David Pelletier in the mid-90s, was that traditionally in public health, we think of the cause of disease as, or the cause of death, excuse me, as these infectious diseases. But in fact, the cause of death is synergistic when there's a high burden of malnutrition, so that you can see here the shaded part of this pie chart is the proportion of deaths that are synergistically attributable to malnutrition. So both the disease and the undernutrition underlie the mortality. And so we know that this happens with various infectious diseases, that when a child is malnourished, they are much more likely to die from that illness. So it brought to mind right away what will happen with an infectious disease that's novel, like COVID-19, where in the upper income countries, we've seen the disease primarily hitting those with weakened immune systems and the elderly, but we're not sure how it will look in lower income settings where there's a high burden of malnutrition. Next slide. And this is some of that data from the 90s that showed that it's mainly the invisible forms of malnutrition, the mild and moderate forms of undernutrition, which are the highest burden. The severe malnutrition is, again, just a smaller proportion of what is causing the mortality in synergy with infectious disease. So before we got started with the panel, I just wanted to remind, a lot of people are familiar with this research, but for those who are not, it's important to keep in mind this disease nutrition interaction. And now I would like to turn over the floor to Tesfaye Hailu, who is joining from Addis Ababa.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you also for organizing this. I would like to thank all the panelists and also ANH Academy for organizing this timely event, timely issue of the continent. So, yeah, next slide, please. Can you hear me? Hello? Yes. Okay. I want to talk about two things. Next slide. Two things in this aspect. The first thing is, I think we all are following what is going on in terms of number of cases of COVID-19 in every country. And still we are seeing also the number is increasing quite fast in Africa, even though it looks small compared to other countries at the moment. After I sent this email, it becomes now 3 times than the previous one. So it shows us how fast it's spreading in the continent. But I want to make emphasis what makes it special, this epidemic in African setting. And then I want to also talk about what needs to be done, especially when it comes to nutrition and also role of sector. So I just want to make a pause for discussion on that aspect. Next. Yeah, so when we see what makes it special for Africa, this COVID-19 is, number one, our way of living condition is very challenging for the current recommendation, which is physical distancing, because of many reasons. One is the way of living, especially if you see in the urban setting, the urban slum area, it is very challenging now to have a physical distancing to be implemented. And the other is the market. If you see, most of the markets are quite large and open market, and it is very also challenging for Africa to implement the physical distancing. And the online marketing system is not also as such developed as we see it now, how countries are trying to cope up with this recommendation. And the other is the burden of malnutrition. So I will refer on this aspect from Global Nutrition Report, which is released recently. It shows us 58 million children, under 5 children are stunted, and around 13 million under 5 children are wasted at this time. And also food security, more than half of the population in Africa is food insecure, and around 277 million population are also under severe food insecurity situation. And poverty is also very high. And HIV as announced, it makes it worse, and it also makes it the vulnerable population is different from what we are seeing it now in other parts of the world. So, so I want to broad in this aspect what should be done differently in nutrition at this critical time. So at this moment, we are trying to adapt with the current situation, stay at home and keep your physical distance, and also work from home, and trying to isolating ourselves from the different working environment. But are we programs if this situation is going on or continued in the same way? If not, what has to be done? What has to be done differently when it comes to program perspective in foods? And we are seeing also a resource because of the different situation I mentioned previously. It will be very complicated, and also the resource will be very limited. So we actually now investing or we have a resource allocated for different nutrition program, mainly putting a target to achieve in the. So if we are not in a position to continue our program in a way how we planned it before, how can we use our current resource, available resource, to program? That is something we have to think. And the other is also what additional resources are needed for nutrition, and how can we get this additional resource? This has to be also seen proactively before we are facing this challenge. And the other is what can we do differently with the available resource to reduce the effect of this epidemic on malnutrition. So these are the questions I want to keep or put emphasis for the discussion. And normally we work in multi-sectoral way. I mean, different sectors have different role to tackle malnutrition problem. Like the health sector at the moment, more focusedly working on how to manage this epidemic. But there are also other sectors who are working, especially when it comes to nutrition, the agriculture sector, the education sector, water, energy, the private sectors, and the social safety net programs, civil society, academia, and also research institutes, development partners, the humanitarian organizations, and also communities. All these have a role in terms of implementing nutrition. So how can we give emphasis to more giving emphasis on the impact of COVID-19 for malnutrition and also the negative impact on food system. So these are the issues I want to bring for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tesfai. And now I'd like to pass the floor to Zdeněka Onuma at UNSCN.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Anna and colleagues, to have organized this very important webinar at this timely point in time. We all feel a little bit disconnected because of the restrictions in physical movement and the social distancing, but this really points out that we are really connected and we are together. We are all in this together and try to find best solutions and way out and to cope at the same time. Tesfai, I will also thank you already for highlighting some very critical issues and challenges specifically for Africa, as well as asking those very valid questions. In UNSCN, we also try to think what would be the best entry point to look at this crisis, this pandemic. And in fact, we thought about it as the team, and we thought what we immediately saw disrupted is in fact our own food environment, the food environment where people meet the system. We had done a bit of work on food environment last year in our flagship publication, Food Environments, where people meet the food system. And in that, we also looked at the very interesting figure of Turner et al. And also you, Anna, were involved in preparing that figure, that graph. And based on that work we did last year, based on that work of Turner and Anna Herford and others, we thought food environment does provide a very helpful entry point to also look at this crisis. And maybe, Will, you can show the slide that we had prepared for it. Yes, please. Thanks a lot. So if you look at the personal domain, you can see clearly that because of the movement restrictions, simply accessibility to food is already disrupted. Once many people, I'm from the Netherlands, and what seemed to be a very simple fact in life to go out for shopping is not that simple anymore. And that's the case in many places, but it's not just the personal domain. When you look at the column for the external domain, you can look at impact there. People start panic buying and the shelves in supermarkets may be empty. You can see open markets are being prohibited or can only partially open. Therefore, again, the availability of food in your personal environment may be limited. But what is also seen is that maybe the shelves for staple foods are empty sometimes. Also, the value change for the more highly value products are being disrupted. And then especially you see that happen or potentially happen for fresh fruits and vegetables, so highly nutritious. So that could have potentially a negative impact on nutrition as well. But then again, we also see that people, governments, private sector start taking actions immediately. Maybe not in a very coordinated way yet, but there are already attempts. The examples we have seen are mainly from industrialized countries and a bit from Asia, for the simple fact that the pandemic started there. But I'm happy we have a few colleagues from Ethiopia here who can highlight also some of the African or Ethiopian examples. But what we see and what can be positive to mitigate the crisis is that governments try to maintain the flow of trade. I already mentioned there is a restriction of movement of people, but very, very explicit, at least in the countries I've seen, food products should still be able to flow. And then in addition to that, and that also has to do with the personal and external domain, social protection schemes are being adapted very quickly to try and protect the many people who are in fact losing their jobs or businesses because of the pandemic. And then there are many attempts by both private and national people and businesses to support local food systems. In many places as well, we see a call on the public to support your locals. And in that way, local food systems are being protected and supported. And we are continuing to collect such examples. As I said, so far we have mainly based our examples on Asia and Europe. But we will try to look for examples in Africa and Latin America. And for that, of course, for the collection of those examples, we are very dependent on you. And for example, the Ag2Nut community. And thanks again to Anna to have organized this. Then back to the UN. The UN is also trying to do its best to make the best evidence-based guidance quickly available. And as UNSCN, we have prepared a list of these resources, ranging from responses in humanitarian situations, a healthy diet guide from FAO, many press releases, health advices, dietary advices from WHO, UNICEF and breastfeeding. Many are available, and more are becoming available as we speak. You find those on the respective websites of these agencies, but also brought together on our own UNSCN.org website. Then specifically to nutrition advices. Also specific nutrition advices have been brought together by several UN agencies. Again, you can find those on the UNSCN note that I believe you've all received the link for through the Ag2Nut COP, where we summarized all that nutrition advice. And what we basically say is we need sustainable, healthy diets produced by sustainable food systems to be able to contribute to the realization of the right to adequate food for all people. This message is not new at all, but the message itself is even more urgent than ever. So do take another look at those nutrition advices. Also look for yourselves, not just as professionals, but also you as a person. It's really important to all of us, for our families and our beloved ones to stay healthy and safe. So COVID-19 is really a serious threat to all of us, to humanity, but we should keep reminding ourselves and everybody, it's not the only threat. We already were facing a nutritional crisis with 1 out of 3 people being malnourished, and Anna and Tesfaye, you already mentioned that as well. And we can see that the many deaths of COVID-19 in fact suffered already from underlying diet-related diseases such as coronary heart diseases and diabetes. But also we faced a real climate change as another threat, and biodiversity is seriously diminishing as well. All these problems are interrelated. So let us take this challenge now as an opportunity to change permanently the ways we produce and what we consume and how we connect with each other. Let's take the promises we made ourselves and the targets we set in the 2030 agenda more seriously. And let's change those many aspects of our ways of living and move to sustainable and resilient food systems for sustainable and healthy diets. Thank you so much again for the opportunity to be here with you, and looking forward to the contributions of the other speakers. Over.
Well, thank you very much, Tineke, and to Cecilia and Anna for organizing this. We're at capacity with 500 people. It's really testament to the power of this Ag2Nut group to come together around this question. I want to be very brief on the economic aspects of this pandemic, so we can get on to discussion about specific regional experiences and what each of you have seen where you're working. The economics of the story really begin with this question of food supply chains, which Tineke mentioned. Remember, this is a disease that isn't waterborne. It's not a vector-borne disease like malaria. It's a disease that happens, that transmits via close contact. So it happens really in group workspaces and face-to-face transactions. And what's most important about our food supply is that agricultural production is already quite dispersed. Family farming can be a very lonely business. I've done it. It's one of the loneliest things I've ever done, being by oneself in a field all day long. But there is vulnerability at many, many locations. And the big immediate risk that we're seeing around the world is governments stopping movement of migrant workers. This is very, very costly in many settings, both to the workers themselves and the food systems that they serve. Also border stoppage and blocking of transport. Stinica mentioned that most governments are actively keeping trade open, but not all. And so advocating for openness for vital food supplies is very, very helpful. And of course, the marketplace photos, which Tesfaye shared at the beginning, are really testament to how important spatial distancing, social distancing at the marketplaces is important. Within the food system, we've seen this massive shift to food at home. So all of a sudden, away from institutional feeding, restaurants and so forth, those have been tremendously valuable safety nets to have food at school, food in institutional settings, and there's huge disparities in people's ability to acquire and prepare food at home, big shifts in the composition of the diet, often worse nutrition because of that. So we'll really keep an eye on what people are able to prepare at home, a lot of neighbor-to-neighbor assistance, but still a need to provide improved delivery and pickup of food that avoids face-to-face contact, because so much safety net activity it required that. The big shock here really is on the economic side is this massive synchronized simultaneous decline in employment and livelihoods. So this is, we have to keep in mind, this is the largest income decline caused by one event in all of human history, because it's synchronized in place. So if one particular industry, one particular group faces a declining income, well, that can be made up for by social insurance and other kinds of safety nets among people. But we really have an unprecedented situation of simultaneous unemployment around the world. It's important to remember that uncontrolled disease would be even worse. So social and spatial distancing, the shutdown of marketplaces and so forth, is in fact the better of the two worst options, but it is the largest income decline in all of human history. And so that income decline is the big shock facing all food production, food service sectors all around the world. There's this global shift to turning to basic necessities, and some of that is panic buying and stocking up unnecessarily. That's very temporary. The permanent thing, or the many months or a whole year, perhaps even several years to catch up, will be this shift to basic necessities. And finally, thinking about what we can do within economics to contribute to all of the heroic work being done in public health and medical systems, and many other agencies responding directly regarding food and nutrition and other direct consequences. On the economic side, I think we can step up with much more sophisticated, careful monitoring of food prices, because that will be something that allows us to detect quickly when there's a supply chain disruption, when there's a price decline that's due to a collapse in income or purchasing power. So I hope that all of you are able to keep an eye on some of these economic factors and take them into account as you do your work. Next, we have Selina Ahmed from Montana State University, who has a lot of great experience in China and in Central America. As Anna mentioned, over to you, Selina. Thank you for joining.
Good morning, everybody from Bozeman, Montana. Today, I am going to share some preliminary data and observations shared by my collaborators and community partners in China, and specifically from smallholder food systems. And so back in January and beginning of February, I began to receive lots of pictures of the food environment from my collaborators and community partners in China via WeChat. And it became very apparent to me very quickly that the coronavirus pandemic really is a food system and food environment issue. And I also began to sort of notice some patterns from where I was receiving these photographs, whether they were people that lived in urban environments that mostly accessed a formal market environment, or those who also relied on informal and cultivated food environments. And so here is sort of a compilation of a few of the images that I've received over the past few months. And some of these may be very familiar to what you are also seeing in your food environments. And so at the end of January, I began to receive a lot of photographs from my collaborators on grocery store shelves that were empty, representing the formal market environment. And this is something that we are now seeing all over the world. And at the same time, I was also receiving photographs from community partners, mostly smallholder subsistence farmers that get most of their food from the cultivated food environment and also occasionally access the informal food environment. And I saw that they had very different situation depending on their access to different types of markets. And so over the past few weeks, we've sort of been chronicling how this pandemic is impacting specifically smallholder farmers and how this varies with access to different types of food environments. And another thing that became very apparent to me was how quickly there was sort of innovation in technology to fulfill some of the food environment needs. And so I think the pandemic overall has really highlighted a lot of strengths as well as vulnerabilities of global, national, and local food systems. And so there's a lot of vulnerabilities and weaknesses, but there's also a lot of strengths that have come into light during this pandemic that I did also want to make note of. So for example, in the formal market environment, underneath these empty shelves, which were sort of the initial photographs I was getting from my collaborators, after a few weeks, they began to have access to fruits and vegetables. And a lot of this was because of innovative platforms via WeChat and delivery systems and fruit and vegetable vendors that were popping up all over the place. And so sort of that fulfilling of distribution has been really innovative and something that's been a really nice positive example of trying to meet the needs for nutrition. Next slide, please. Next, thank you. And so over the past few weeks, we have been focusing on looking at the natural food environment as well as the built food environment. And some of the preliminary findings that we are seeing is that households that have access to multiple types of food environments are the ones that are seeming to be more resilient. And this is a question that and this is in the short term, and this is a question that I want to pose to the group and to also see if this will continue in the future for long-term effects, if the access to diversified food environments will ultimately help having higher dietary diversity and food quality in the long term. Next slide, please. And so this is some very preliminary data coming out from our interviews across different agroclimatic zones and provinces throughout China. This is very preliminary data. This is from 55 key informants in different smallholder households. And we asked a set of questions to understand changes in the food environment and agroecosystems and food systems more broadly, as well as effects on income. And so kind of looking at the graphs really quickly, you will see the darker blue indicates yes, and the lighter blue indicates a no. And so when we asked people if their household income has changed, about 93% of the households have seen a change in household income. And so this is either because people have lost their jobs or because as farmers selling crops that they're actually receiving less demand or unable to get their food to market. And so they're seeing a lower income. And so this is sort of across all of the households. But what was really interesting to me was when we asked people if their diet has changed, only 20% of the households responded that they've actually seen a change in diet. And so I thought that was really interesting, and that really sort of highlights the importance of having access to food and local food systems, food that you've cultivated yourself, wild foods, as well as local food systems. And so I think in thinking about agriculture to nutrition and thinking about programs, I feel like this pandemic is really highlighting the need for co-designing healthy local food systems. And we also asked the households about changes in food availability as well as affordability. And overall, the majority, about 73% of the households have responded that food has become more expensive. However, it's not impacting their diets as much because, as I mentioned before, these communities tend to rely on food that they have grown themselves. They've also seen shifts in what is available. And then in terms of farming practices, there's been a lot of shifts in terms of the schedule because of quarantines and access to labor. And also a lot of farmers are beginning to see shifts in their access to farm inputs, including seeds and fertilizers. And the communities that really have a more circular farming economy, where they're really relying on their own community for these resources and following more agroecological principles, are seeing less of a threat to their farming input. So really, again, highlighting some of the principles for sustainable agriculture. Next slide, please. And so overall, what we're seeing in these communities, just based on very preliminary information, is that dietary diversity is very much linked to diversity at the landscape and a diversity of food environments. And as we move forward, these are just very short-term effects, but I'm very curious to know what the long-term effects will be, and if the traditional socio-ecological determinants of resilience that we see in the food system will also hold for this pandemic. I'm also very curious to know how this pandemic is interacting with existing vulnerabilities. For example, some of the farmers have noted that they already have a lot of climate risk, and they're very concerned with how drought may interact with the coronavirus pandemic. And also an aging farming population, especially here where I am in the United States. The average age of an American farmer is 58 years old. As Will mentioned, we also have a lot of migrant farmers who face existing labor inequities. Another sort of vulnerability is chronic disease. So here in Montana, rural and tribal communities have a higher rate of chronic disease and severe obesity compared to the overall population. And these are two risk factors for heightened severity of COVID infections. And another inequity faced by the population here in Montana is food access. And so the ability to stock up can be seen as a advantage for many communities. And in the tribal communities that I'm working in, a lot of households can't afford to stock up. And so outsiders from outside the community are coming into their community to sort of hoard food. And this is causing another resource issue from existing food access. And so one thing I really want us to think about is what can we learn from this pandemic in co-designing food systems that are resilient and equitable to global change as climate change interacts with existing vulnerabilities and new vulnerabilities such as this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Selena, and everyone who's presented so far. Over to you, Namukolo, for your reflections and reactions.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. So in terms of reacting, I'm going to sort of like start from the diets in terms that we would expect diets on the African continent to change. And the reason is because with the mobility, when we are cutting down on movement, A lot of the people that are in
You are muted.
Sorry. So my reaction, I want to go around some elements of the food systems that have been mentioned, starting with diets, the quality of diets, to say that based on what is going now, the expectation would be that diet quality would suffer. There's a lot of movement of the food, for example, in the picture that Tesfaye showed, a lot of that food would be moving from outside the urban centers, from the rural areas, the peri-urban areas, coming into town. And that's the movement that is being prevented with the lockdowns that are in place now. So movement, particularly of fresh foods, is going to be affected. But at the same time, incomes will also be lowered. A lot of the informal sector operates on hand-to-mouth basis, and so what they produce that day, they will then purchase additional food supplies that they might need, and so that is interrupted quite significantly. There was talk about migration into the rural areas. There are signs of this happening across the continent. When the impending lockdowns were coming, a lot of people tried to move back into rural areas. The issue there is the fact that the rural settings then end up with additional mouths to feed that they usually don't have. So that can put pressure on whatever stocks of food people would have had in the rural areas, even where it would have been enough to carry them through a short period of time. This is now not going to be possible. Now, there's a likelihood that we might shift more strongly to cereal-based diets, just because they are non-perishable and they've been easier to stock up. Now, most people will not have refrigeration or anything. So if people are going to stock up, the likelihood is it's going to be cereal-based products that they are going to stock up on. Going forward, this also points to potential opportunities for technologies such as biofortification that puts micronutrients into these staple foods. So perhaps we could learn from there and see how we could do better. Now, in terms of production, I think production, it really depends on how the situation evolves in different parts of the continent. What we need to keep in mind is that production of food in Africa comes in different times of the year in different places. We tend to think of it as a global South continent, but really we come into production season at different times. And so for each country, there will be need to look at when what season we are in now, what is coming next, and how the disruptions in movements and the lockdown, and as well as the disruptions in economic activities, is going to affect the different aspects of both production, harvesting, as well as being able to reach markets. What we find is that we are dealing with government budgets that are usually very constrained to start with. So with the lockdown, businesses are not operating as they should, so government revenues are going to go down even further. The implication is that going forward, the crisis is not just going to be at the individual level in terms of lost income and lost time for food production. There's also going to be issues around governments actually not having adequate resources to help the situation. If I look at what is happening, I'm cut off in South Africa now. I am based in Ethiopia for work, but I have been locked down in South Africa. But looking at what is happening here in South Africa, there are some social protection measures that have been put in place, which have been running anyway. And what has happened now is they've been struggling to actually make the payments because of the restrictions on movement. Then the other thing is, while there are packages that are being promised for small and medium scale enterprises, the informal sector is largely untouched. And it's not clear how they are going to be helped, because they're not organized enough for you to have channels through which to actually assist the informal sector. This is relevant to much of Africa, because a lot of food marketing takes place in an informal setting. And so we have to find ways in which governments can be able to assist the informal sector. I think what we are going towards is not just going to be one affected by the COVID-19. For Eastern Africa, we also have the locust infestation that is ongoing at the same time. So there's an additional pressure in place that is going to affect the situation. What can we do? In terms of policies, one of the biggest constraints that African governments are going to face is just the fact that the resources are so constrained, and this is going to put additional pressure on that. The resources that are going into mitigation of infections and treatment, that is money that was not budgeted for. And that's going to come out of a budget that was not already enough for what was supposed to be the normal business of government. So really, it's going to take a lot of effort in terms of all of the different programs that were being planned and being put in place. There will be need for government sitting together with different development partners to look at ways in which we might be able to revisit these programs to see what we can do in the short term to avert hunger and to avert just large scale problems of running into situations of severe acute malnutrition, especially for young children. So there is really a need to think out of the box and think about how we are going to mitigate the situation, because it's not going to be as easy to address as it has been in the countries that have so far been badly affected. When it comes to social protection, although African governments in general had embraced social protection, a lot of our social protection measures, perhaps with the exception of South Africa and some of the Northern African countries, have largely been donor dependent. And we are really in a situation where the countries where we would normally ask for help from are themselves grappling with the situation. So the likelihood of them being able to come on board as effectively as they would have otherwise is likely to be limited. Again, even there, it requires some kind of a global effort to try and coordinate so that the limited resources that are going to be available can be used most effectively, but looking at different contexts across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Namokolo. Thank you to all of the panelists for sharing. This is a very rich discussion and amount of information. And with 500 people online, of course, we're getting lots and lots of comments and really good material. So one thing that I'd like to note is that several people have asked whether the comments and questions and resources being shared will be collected. Yes, we will put those together. After the call, we'll be working on that, and we will put together a resource document. Many people in these communities have shared resources that their various networks have worked on. For example, Nutritious Agriculture Network shared a resource. Of course, we have SCN compilations, and ANH Academy has a resources page on COVID-19 as well. So yes, we will put those together. We also clearly will not be able to get to all of the comments, but we originally planned for this call to be an hour. Of course, we're almost to the hour, so thanks to the Tufts team, we're actually able to keep the line open for another half hour to enable discussion. So understanding that certain people will not be able to stay online for the whole time, we will follow up with the resources that have been gathered so far, but also we will have now this extra time to be able to discuss. So Cecilia has been working on collecting all of the chat questions, and there are a few themes that have come up. So what I would like to do is present some of the groups of questions that have come up on the chat box. And then if you have a response, anyone who's on the call, we thought there was a raise hand button, but it doesn't seem to be there. So if you would like to be unmuted and be able to respond verbally, please type into the chat box that you would like to speak, and we will try to keep track of people in the order that they request. So one group of questions was around just observations and questions to the global community. So Florence Egal was asking, is there evidence of out-migration from Addis Ababa and other African cities as people lose their livelihoods or escape from the disease? From Irmgard, is they're noting an observation that in Germany, school feeding dependent children from low-income families are getting more food insecure. Are there similar observations from other regions? I think that there were also some observations that I didn't quite copy and paste in time from Sunita Kadiala about what's happening in terms of migration in India. Okay, so then there is a second group of questions that has to do with the effect of the lockdown on informal vendors. So a participant from Nepal is saying that there's a challenge of harvesting wheat in the month of April now, and also planting rice and maize in the middle of the lockdown. Furthermore, fruits and vegetables are not reaching markets due to non-functional market systems and transportation closures. So what can we do in this system to maintain the food system? So there's both the upstream, the planting and the labor, and then the downstream, sort of the market and movement into retail and people being able to purchase foods. Then there's a set of very rich comments from Marie Chantal Messier, writing from Ghana, talking about the effect of the lockdown on food security of daily earners who are often outside the formal system, such as ladies selling in wet markets or on the roadsides, and their clients who also buy daily. What solutions can be put in place to minimize the impact on their food security and the availability of foods? Also, what alternative routes to market can be put in place rapidly for local food producers to still deliver in a lockdown environment, such as in Ghana, local fruit and veg producers rapidly putting together a website and offering to deliver at home. Similarly, Leonard Mitzi wrote, what is the experience with e-commerce and delivery to avoid buying in supermarkets and having higher risks in terms of contagion? Can the digital agenda be a true game changer or not? How do we link better to small farmers for better price transparency? Okay, so now I'll stop after this third set of questions. The third set of questions and comments has to do with the need for information, data, and modeling. So a question from Ahmad Kablan. about in Africa, there's high rates of TB, immunocompromised subjects with HIV/AIDS, combined with malnutrition. This could be a perfect storm. How do we anticipate the impacts of COVID-19 on this? And has there been any modeling? Also, has there been any modeling on how much food production and trade might be affected? Would food availability be reduced significantly? Lillian asks, is real-time data being collected as the pandemic unfolds? We might learn the most from the impact of COVID on the food system and nutrition in retrospect if we're not able to collect real-time data. There's also a question, so Selena showed some very interesting data on that even within 1 month of the pandemic, diets for most people, the majority of people didn't change significantly. But the question is, will there be an impact on diet after a longer period of time if food systems are affecting the availability and affordability of food? How will the impact be different for those who rely on built versus natural food environments? And a question from Irmgard, has anyone observed whether more highly processed foods have been consumed? Sunita commented, based on personal communication, yes, there's a lot of consumption of processed foods that combine the sedentary lifestyles that this epidemic imposes as a real threat to health, more on the NCD's side. I would add that from the US perspective, people who are dependent on food aid, they often received highly processed packaged foods as the form of aid rather than fresh foods. So there are challenges with regard to diet quality there. So I'll stop there with the comments. So first, there was effective lockdown on informal vendors and need for data and modeling, and then observations about what people are actually seeing in terms of migration and effects already on food insecurity. So Cecilia, I'll turn it over to you. She's been keeping track of anyone who has a hand raised.
Yeah, there was a gentleman, Jorge, who wanted to ask a question. Let me see if we can, Jorge, I'll try to unmute you.
Thank you. And in the meantime, anyone else who would like to respond to any of those points that have been raised, please note in the chat box. Thank you.
Yes, I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you so much. I was remembering one comment that was mentioned by Selena Ahmed about wild food environments being more resilient. And I wanted to follow up on that and ask if these include community food forests, or is she talking about wild foraged foods, or both? And to ask her if she could please elaborate on this, because we have a project about community food forests. It's called freefoodforfuture.org, and it's all about giving the resources so people get empowered to have available food grown locally without any means of change of money. In every public space, even golf courses, national parks, city parks, everywhere, this food needs to be available for free for everyone, and everyone needs to contribute. So I'm wondering if Selena Ahmed was referring to these kinds of wild environments, not agriculture anymore, but food environments and habitats everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. That's a wonderful question. Yes, I was saying that wild and cultivated food environments that are circular, so that have as many inputs from, the least inputs from outside the system, are right now shown to be more resilient, just based on the evidence that we've been collecting and that's has been published. And I would say that, you know, community food forests are excellent examples of these natural food environments. And it'd be great to see more resources to learn more about the community food forest work that you are doing.
Thank you very much. And great that you shared the resource. We'll put that in the list. I think, so Will was noting there is actually a raise hand button. Maybe I can't see it because of being a host, it's possible. So if you see a raise hand button, feel free to use it. And
Florence Eagle would like to speak. Sorry, I just saw
thank
it.
you. Thank you very much. Yes, Florence, the floor is yours.
I am muted by the host. Oh, okay, thank you. Yes, thank you very much, and thanks for organizing this meeting. This is fascinating. I have put in the chat box a reference to the D Group Food for Cities, which is hosted in FAO, but which has 2,500 members. Many of you are already on that list. I can see Anna shaking her head. And there's quite an active discussion right now on COVID-19 and food systems that could be expected. The second point is I've been following this quite closely since Wuhan, actually, and I was thrilled to hear the presentation by Selena. There is, I think, very much still a disconnect between health and food. When we see the way it is presented, it is very logically presented as a health emergency. So it's mask, ventilator, people dying, etc. But there is clearly, and we all know it, and there is an impact on food. But I think we all have a responsibility in trying to bridge that gap and bring food more into the communication, whether it's on newspapers, TV, whatever it is, or social network, is really important. Everywhere, I think people that are blocked at home spend more time cooking. So in many ways, this is good. And actually, I think, at least I know better the situation in France and Italy, people rediscover small shops, small farmers are desperate to sell their production. So they are starting to set e-commerce platform or join them. So it is accelerating a trend towards going back to traditional foods. One of the problems that was mentioned by somebody, and we can find also in France, and I expect we're going to find it in India and in so many places, it's people that are leaving big cities to go back to rural areas. And right now, the people migrating in India or going back to Nepal, they can't even cross the border, and they're going back to areas which already are food insecure. So these people leaving not only bring the virus with them, but they also put pressure on local food system. And this is something that's really important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florence, for sharing those important resources. It's really helpful to bring what other communities have been discussing as well. We have another participant waiting to speak, Edward Alexander.
One of the things I'm concerned about is that low vitamin A is very common in many areas, and it's really crucial for prevention of pneumonia. There's very good data on this and other kinds of lung disease. And I would urge that golden rice be adopted where rice is grown, and possibly increase sweet potatoes. If that's, people can be encouraged to do that. They don't need to be so fresh, and they're a wonderful source of, beta carotene. There are other vegetables that I won't take time to go into because it's so varied. And one more comment, the wild food is probably good for some people, but I am concerned that the Chinese have reopened the wet markets in China, which has been the source of the problem, apparently, with COVID-19 and other previous virus situations. So the environment they have there in those wet markets does not seem to be very well controlled. So that's it for me.
Thank you very much. So point there to potentially use biofortification So as a means toward improving access to nutritious food. Also, I think the same point goes for other kinds of naturally nutrient-dense foods where we are seeing issues in supply chains. So issues around how that interacts with the pandemic. And I believe Namukolo, you had a comment about that?
Yes, there is actually, that is quite an opportunity for the African continent, because we've actually had more biofortified crops released on the African continent than we are seeing in other places. So we have staples like we have vitamin A cassava. We've got vitamin A maize that has been released in a number of countries. And then of course we have the orange sweet potato that's also been released in quite a number of countries. Then there is zinc millet in some West African countries. So going forward, those are some of the things that where those are available, because of the fact that people are likely to be consuming a much more cereal-based diet, more staple foods that they usually would have in stock. Promoting those within the COVID-19 context would be useful. Thank you.
Thank you. And someone has commented, Ahmad Kablan, that golden rice particularly still needs approvals. So it isn't exactly an option on the table right now. I think it brings up the larger issue that several of the panelists brought up at the beginning, which is we already knew that there were huge problems in terms of very large segments of populations in every country, particularly in Africa and South Asia, being unable to access nutritious diets. So is there an opportunity here to look at food systems in a new way to ultimately reach that goal better of improving access to nutritious diets for everyone in a time where that access is really challenging our systems? And there was another comment from Leonard Mitzi that it's important to look at this in a multidisciplinary way. So where can health and nutrition and food and agriculture communities communicate more and not in silos? Is this an opportunity? I'd like to take his comment to say, how can we take this as an opportunity for future, more robust research and more robust multidisciplinary actions? So I'm just looking for other comments to bring to the floor. Cecilia, feel free to intervene if there are hands raised. We also have a response from from NAN, Kenya. I think that's an acronym for something, that there's an online forum on COVID-19 food story where participants are answering questions with regard to changes in their food during this pandemic. So in a week's time, the results can be shared to answer some of the questions that were brought up earlier about actually what is happening and how our diet's changing. So thank you very much for that intervention. That will be fascinating. Several other resources have been posted. So another group of questions has come up as well, which are about donor priorities and potential funding. Eureka Ueda asked, does the pandemic affect budget allocation of donors or organizations? More resources toward emergency assistance and delaying nutrition sensitive programming? And another question from, I can't find the name here. Is there a fund that can support data for policy scoping with the COVID-19 impacts? Does anyone know about how funding allocation may be changing? So any comments you have, feel free to raise a hand or put them in the chat box. Any further observations on either the policy side or a lot of the questions that came up around market disruptions from our panelists?
Also, we do have people that have raised their hand. Somehow we can't see the hand raised option with the host. So thank you for letting us know. But there's Patricia Northalber and Irmgard have raised their hand.
Excellent. So let's start with Patricia. Thank you.
Hi. Good morning, everyone.
We can
Hello?
hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this wonderful webinar, and we learned a lot from the discussions and the chat comments. But one of the factors that I felt was missing in the discussion was the whole issue of the political economy of our food systems. We're looking towards trying to make adjustments within COVID. What about the structural constraints that have actually put a lot of the countries that we've been discussing on the deep vulnerabilities? Speaking from the Caribbean, we've had a history of a very long relationship with the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, and high ratios of debt to GDP, which have really made it impossible to fund fundamental infrastructural facilities, have forced a policy of outwardness, which have reduced the capacities to focus on domestic food security, and the levels of non-responsiveness of financial institutions in a time of crisis, downgrading governments, and South Africa being a country in point, but their credit rating being reduced to junk status. So it just seems to me that there is a very sharp context of negative constraints that have created vulnerabilities, reduced capacities, and at the same time in a crisis are making things even harder by putting into place onerous measures of credit rating, which would increase the cost of accessing debt if that was desired by national governments to try and respond to the crisis. Personally, I think there should be a focus on massive debt relief and restructuring in order to give the fiscal space that is necessary for the restructuring of economies towards upgrading domestic capacities and meeting emergencies that are on the ground now. So I think food security and the health dynamics of our food systems must be discussed in the context of a very liberal and negatively biased towards the rich and the elite system of control.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, larger systems certainly at play major economic issues to grapple with for countries. Irmgard, if you have your hand up still, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I do come from the German perspective, and I observe that COVID-19 is also perceived as some kind of an opportunity to change towards a more sustainable food systems in establishing smaller food value chains and establishing again open food markets, farmers markets, etc. So I'm wondering whether some similar observations should and could be made in Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and to be able to come up to these type of conclusions on whether we could establish a certain guideline, observation guideline, as a huge community to see in our individual countries, as we are all locked down in our positions where we are, to check on whether we observe something positive, negative, on certain key observations we may do. And this way have a more common and more harmonized approach with all our single observations. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Excellent. So again, there are opportunities here. So how can we best seize them? Sunita wanted to make a quick comment. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all, and thank you Ag2Nut and all the speakers for this. It's been really interesting to be able to bring people together. Just quickly, as I said in my comments box, is that the Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy with Ag2Nut and other partners is quite keen to convene a series of webinars. And one of the things we are thinking is about how our practice as well as research has will have to change, at least in the foreseeable future, in the time of social distancing. So we're quite keen to hear ideas for speakers, as well as any thoughts you might have on the topic in terms of what we could do as a community to spur that dialogue. The second thing I also want to say is COVID, while it is different, it is different in many different ways. There is a temptation, and of course, we have to rely on the evidence on comparing it with other epidemics or the food price crisis. But we are having all of that together in one goal. Both health, economic, social systems, all of them are affected at the same time. So I don't have an answer, but I'm just wondering if we could all continue to think of it in terms of what will perhaps, economists would say as large covariant shocks, but on multiple levels at multiple systems. So to me, that level of critical thinking, I look forward to from all of you and the community. And if you have any ideas on how we can take a practice, policy, or a research agenda, just definitely we are happy to act as a facilitator or a convener, or obviously your co-traveler in this journey. Thank you.
Fantastic. And thank you so much, Sunita, and everyone at ANH Academy for the partnership and collaboration on these issues. And I fully agree. Let's keep in touch and keep tabs on how to move forward together. We have another hand raised from Charles Opillo.
Thank you so much. I am coming from Uganda, and the issue I wanted to raise, I see someone already typing about it, about the neglected and underutilized species of crops. That is now the role of local food plans in trying to help to fight against the COVID-19. And if you look at the staple food, the local food crops that are like in most urban markets, a good proportion is really of the neglected and underutilized species. And now there was also a question on how the lockdown has impacted the informal food dealers. And these informal food dealers, some of them are dealing in these neglected species. So for our country, I think the impact has been really negative, because they are mainly in an informal arrangement whereby they don't have a very specific place. Sometimes they work with their food, the vegetables, the fruits, and people buy them as they move. So now they're no longer available. They have to go to the market where they don't even have space, because they can't afford to rent a space. And even the people in the market, there's this social distancing guideline where now each trader is supposed to be 4 meters away from each other. And that means within a bigger space, only few traders can be able to deal or to sell food. That means the quantity or the supply will also reduce, and therefore the price will be higher, because the demand will be overweighing the supply. Another point that I want to raise, and maybe we need to look at critically, is the role of private sectors. I joined the call late. I don't know whether it was adequately discussed. Private sectors in trying to help, in supplementing or fortifying the food that they deal in, like especially the processors. Like some of these research, like the vitamin-rich foods, some of them could not have happened at the time of breeding, but at the processing time, they can also be fortified to have this enhanced kind of nutritional strength. So I think these are issues that we can look at, how we can bring on board private sector to help improve the food quality in terms of diversity, in terms of nutrition, so that it can be able to fight the COVID pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those points. I want to take the opportunity to raise a related point sent in by Marie Chantal Messier on the role of the food companies and private sector in maintaining functional food systems in times of crisis, particularly for the poor. Examples beyond cash assistance could be enhanced local sourcing, pre-buying at a fixed price, paying premiums for keeping kids in school, setting up a safety net within the particular value chain being purchased, such as interest-free loans, employee volunteering, and many, many other solutions could be put forward. So thank you for raising that role of the private sector. We have 5 minutes left on the call and a couple more hands raised. So let's go briefly to Gina Kennedy.
Thanks. So I feel like my contribution has been stated several times already. So thanks to the colleague from Uganda who I put in the resource for neglected and underutilized species. And I would fully agree with Namakulo's comment as well as Selena's remarks on trying to use all resources possible to get food and micronutrient healthy food on the plates of consumers. So I fully agree with the fact that we need to be looking also at the wild and cultivated food environments in addition to the built food environment. And then also there's been a lot of research on seasonal food availability, and that connects with the neglected and underutilized species. So kind of combining the global pool of knowledge on what's there, and then seeing what are the barriers and facilitators to enabling consumers to be able to take up those foods that might be less familiar, how to prepare, how to harvest, prepare, get the seeds, and be able to use that as a resource. So just kind of to remember that we do have a lot of work on seasonal food availability, neglected and underutilized species. And so maybe it's a sub community of practice that emerges out of the Ag2Nut group. So again, thanks Anna for organizing this and everybody else who was the co-organizer. It was a very rich discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Gina. And thanks for your participation. We'll go to the last hand that we have raised, which is Penguinde. I hope I said your name right.
There is also, if Penguinde is not available, Cornelia Ezima has her hand raised too.
All right.
This is, yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Even though I joined a little bit late, but I still have a concern concerning about supporting the people in the rural. I'm calling from Nigeria. People that are in the rural areas, how we can support them with perishable, nutritious food. I don't know if this was discussed earlier, because with this lockdown, most of them need immediate food support because of this COVID-19.
Thank you very much. I think that is a key concern going forward. It really encapsulates what I've felt emerged from this discussion. Really is that this is a unique moment in time. It's a moment where food systems and health systems and social systems are being shaken like we have never seen. And for the interest of creating a world that provides access to nutritious food and cares for the nutritionally vulnerable and heals those who are malnourished, this is a moment where we can think creatively about how to move towards that vision. And this is a time when public health has been prioritized in a way that we have rarely seen. You know, those of us who have advocated tirelessly for the huge impact on sickness and mortality from malnutrition and from climate change and food insecurity, where those have not been prioritized, now they are front and center. They are exposed. So people are not only exposed to the disease, we are exposed to the underlying systems and whether they support well-being and food security. So I'd like to stop there and just say that there's so many rich ideas that have been shared in the comment box, also by email for those who have joined by phone. Keep sending your comments and we will be working on putting them all together. It's possible that Cecilia's noting that you can copy the entire thread of the chat box, but we will also be doing that and sharing the resources that have been shared. So thank you to all the panelists once again for starting this discussion off with so many important concerns. Thank you in particular to TES5 for bringing it to the attention of Ag2Nut as a topic we should discuss, and to Will Masters for facilitating the platform and the team at Tufts. And thank you for everyone to join this conversation, and let's move forward towards better food systems and nutrition coming out of this epidemic. Thank you.